She rejected my proposal, saying her career came first, so I just nodded and walked away. I'm a high school history teacher and football coach, 31 years old, the kind of guy who shows up when he says he will and believes in building something real with someone you love. Victoria was a corporate litigation attorney at one of Boston's top firms, brilliant and driven in ways that both impressed and occasionally intimidated me. We'd been together for 2 years, and I genuinely thought we were building towards something permanent. Our normal life was good, really good, the kind of comfortable partnership where we'd spend Sunday mornings reading different sections of the newspaper, where she'd help me grade papers while I made dinner, where we'd debate legal cases and historical parallels like it was the most natural thing in the world. I loved watching her work through complex legal arguments, the way her mind moved through problems with surgical precision, and she seemed to appreciate my steadiness, the way I could ground her when the pressure at her firm got overwhelming. That Tuesday evening in October, I took her to our favorite steakhouse in downtown Boston, the same place where we'd had our third date, where she'd first told me about her childhood dream of becoming a lawyer after watching her immigrant parents get taken advantage of by landlords who knew they wouldn't fight back. I had the ring in my jacket pocket, a simple solitaire I'd saved for months to buy, and I was nervous in the best possible way, the kind of nervous that comes from knowing you're about to ask the most important question of your life. When dessert arrived, I reached for the ring box, but the moment I started to speak, something in Victoria's expression shifted, a look I'd never seen before, like she was watching a car accident in slow motion. "Michael, what are you doing?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, and I realized she'd gone completely still, her fork suspended halfway to her mouth. "I'm asking you to marry me," I said, opening the ring box, but instead of the joy I'd expected, I saw something that looked almost like panic cross her face. She set down her fork and closed her eyes for a long moment, and when she opened them again, there were tears. "I can't," she said, the words coming out flat and final. "I can't accept this." I felt like the air had been knocked out of me, but I kept my voice steady. "Can you tell me why?" She took a shaky breath and looked down at her hands. "Michael, I'm 29 years old, and I've worked every single day since law school to get where I am. 80-hour weeks, weekend research, networking events I hate, sucking up to senior partners who still call me sweetheart in depositions. I'm finally close to making partner, and if I do this, if I get married now, everything changes." I tried to understand what she was saying. "Victoria, I'm not asking you to quit your job. I know how important your career is." "It's not about quitting," she said, wiping her eyes with her napkin. "It's about perception, about priorities. The partners watch everything. They want to know you're committed, that nothing will interfere with your dedication to the firm. Marriage means compromise, Michael. It means thinking about someone else's schedule, someone else's needs, someone else's timeline. I can't afford that right now." I reached across the table, but she pulled her hands back. "We could have a long engagement," I offered. "You could keep your maiden name. We could wait on kids until you make partner." She shook her head, more tears spilling over. "Those are band-aid solutions to a fundamental problem. You're asking me to choose, and I'm choosing my career. I have to." The restaurant continued buzzing around us, other couples laughing and sharing dessert, while our entire future crumbled over untouched creme brulee. "So where does that leave us?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "I love you," she said, her voice breaking. "I love you so much it terrifies me. But I love my career trajectory more, and I can't ask you to wait indefinitely for someone who may never be ready for what you want." I sat there for a moment, processing the honesty that was somehow both brutal and kind. She wasn't lying to spare my feelings or making empty promises about the future. She was telling me exactly where I stood in her priorities, and I had to respect that, even as it destroyed me. "Thank you," I said finally, closing the ring box and putting it back in my pocket. "For being honest. For not stringing me along." She looked surprised, like she'd expected an argument. "That's it? You're not going to try to change my mind?" I smiled, though it felt like my chest was caving in. "Victoria, if I have to convince you to marry me, then you're not the person I should be marrying." We sat in silence for a few minutes, both of us crying quietly, both of us knowing this was the end. Finally, I paid the check, walked her to her car, and kissed her forehead goodbye. "I hope you make partner," I said, and I meant it. "I hope you get everything you want." As I watched her drive away, I realized that sometimes loving someone means accepting that you're not what they need, even when they're exactly what you thought you needed. The next morning, Victoria threw herself into her legal work with the kind of desperate intensity that only comes from trying to outrun your own emotions. Within a week, she'd volunteered for the Morrison Pharmaceutical merger, a case that would require 80-hour weeks and constant travel between Boston and New York. I heard about it through mutual friends before I stopped asking for updates, how she was suddenly the first one in the office and the last one to leave, how she'd taken on 3 additional high-profile corporate litigation cases that the senior partners had been hesitant to assign to someone so young. Her assistant mentioned to someone who mentioned to someone else that Victoria had started sleeping in her office rather than going home, surviving on vending machine coffee and takeout sushi while she built ironclad arguments for Fortune 500 companies. She was proving her dedication the only way she knew how, by making herself indispensable to people who measured worth in billable hours and successful settlements. Meanwhile, I focused on healing the only way that made sense to me, by pouring everything I had into my students and my football team. I started staying after school to help kids who were struggling with history assignments, organizing study groups for AP students, volunteering to chaperone every field trip and school dance that needed supervision. My players noticed the change immediately, how I was suddenly available for extra practice sessions, how I'd drive across town to watch their games when they played for club teams during the off-season, how I remembered their girlfriends' names and asked about their college applications with genuine interest. Coach has been different lately. I overheard Tommy Martinez tell his teammates after practice. More intense, but like in a good way. Like he actually sees us as people instead of just players. It was true, in a way I hadn't expected. Losing Victoria had stripped away some protective layer I didn't even know I'd built around my heart, and suddenly I was more present for everyone else in my life, more willing to invest in relationships that actually had room for me in them. The physical separation happened quickly and efficiently, like everything else Victoria did when she'd made up her mind. 2 weeks after our breakup, she moved out of our shared apartment near Fenway Park into a luxury high-rise in the financial district, one of those glass towers where successful people lived successful lives above the noise and chaos of regular existence. She packed her things while I was at practice, leaving her key on the kitchen counter with a note that simply said, "Thank you for understanding." The apartment felt enormous and hollow without her books scattered across every surface, without her coffee cups in the sink, without the sound of her practicing opening arguments in the shower. For the first month, I'd catch myself listening for her key in the door, expecting to hear her heels clicking across the hardwood floor as she complained about incompetent opposing counsel or celebrated small victories in cases I'd never fully understood. But instead of wallowing in the ghost of our relationship, I did something that surprised even me. I completely redecorated. I painted over the soft gray walls she'd insisted were sophisticated, with warm blues and greens that reminded me of hiking trails and ocean views. I replaced our formal dining table with a comfortable sectional where I could grade papers and watch football games. I hung photos from my travels, my family, my team's championship seasons, creating space for the parts of myself that had somehow gotten smaller during our 2 years together. The bedroom got the biggest transformation. New furniture, new bedding, everything arranged to suit someone who wasn't trying to accommodate someone else's need for symmetrical nightstands and blackout curtains. Both of us avoided mutual friends for several months, making our split clean and final in a way that probably confused people who'd expected more drama. When Jake and Lisa invited me to their usual Sunday brunch, I politely declined, knowing Victoria would be there. When our book club tried to schedule around both our calendars, I quietly removed myself from the group text. It wasn't about avoiding confrontation or holding grudges. It was about giving both of us space to become whoever we were going to be next without the weight of what we'd been together. I heard through the grapevine that Victoria was doing the same thing, declining dinner invitations and skipping birthday parties where she might have to explain our breakup or pretend everything was fine. We'd built a social circle together, and now we were both stepping back from it, allowing our friends to choose sides or maintain separate relationships with each of us without the awkwardness of forcing everyone to navigate our new reality. By spring, I realized I felt lighter than I had in years, not because Victoria had been a burden, but because I'd been trying so hard to be the right person for her that I'd forgotten how to be myself. 2 years after rejecting Michael's proposal, I achieved everything I'd thought I wanted. I made junior partner at 31, becoming the youngest woman in my firm's history to reach that level, a milestone that should have felt like vindication for every sacrifice I'd made along the way. The senior partners called me into the conference room on a Thursday morning, and when they offered me the position, I felt this surge of pure satisfaction, the kind of achievement high that comes from proving everyone wrong who ever doubted whether a girl from a working-class family could make it in corporate law. I'd worked for this moment since my first day of law school, when my contracts professor told us that only 1 in 10 of us would make partner anywhere, and probably none of us would do it before 35. The promotion came with everything I'd dreamed of: a corner office with windows overlooking Boston Harbor, my name on the letterhead, a salary that finally matched the hours I'd been putting in for years. I celebrated alone with expensive wine and takeout sushi, sitting in my luxury apartment, feeling like I'd conquered the world. But the romantic side of my life became this endless series of disappointments that I kept telling myself didn't matter because I was focused on more important things. My first serious relationship after Michael was with Richard, a fellow attorney at a competing firm who specialized in securities law and seemed like the perfect match on paper. We met at a bar association event, bonded over war stories about difficult clients, and started what I thought would be a partnership between equals. For 8 months, we dated like it was another business deal to manage between court appearances, scheduling dinners around depositions, having conversations that somehow always circled back to billable hours and client development strategies. Richard was intelligent and successful, drove a BMW, wore expensive suits, everything that should have impressed me, but our relationship felt transactional in ways that made me uncomfortable. We'd compare case victories like keeping score, argue about legal strategy over dinner, turn romantic evenings into networking opportunities when we inevitably ran into colleagues at every restaurant worth going to. "We should probably make this official," he said one night after we'd been together for 6 months, referring to our relationship like he was discussing a merger agreement. "It makes sense for both our careers to be seen as a power couple in the legal community." The way he said it, like love was a strategic decision, made something in my chest feel hollow. When Richard got an offer from a firm in New York and suggested I should look for positions there too, I realized I felt nothing but relief when our relationship ended, like I'd been holding my breath for months without realizing it. My next relationship was with Kevin, a cardiac surgeon who worked the kind of hours that made my schedule look reasonable, and I thought surely someone who understood professional dedication would be different. Kevin was brilliant, literally saved lives for a living, had hands that could perform miracles, and seemed to appreciate that I had my own demanding career that required the same level of commitment as his. But 6 months into our relationship, I calculated that we'd actually had 3 real dates. Everything else had been grabbing coffee between his surgeries and my client meetings, texting each other during brief breaks, falling into bed exhausted without really talking about anything that mattered. "I'm sorry I had to cancel dinner again," he'd text me from the hospital. "Emergency surgery ran late. Rain check." Rain checks became our relationship, a series of postponements and rescheduled plans, 2 people so busy being important that we forgot to be present with each other. The breaking point came when Kevin's mother was visiting from Chicago, and he asked me to meet her over lunch, except he got called into surgery halfway through the appetizer, leaving me to make awkward conversation with a woman who kept asking when we were planning to get married while I realized I barely knew her son well enough to answer basic questions about his childhood. During this period, I started noticing something about my married colleagues that I'd never paid attention to before. The partners who had families seemed more grounded, more efficient, like they drew energy from their stable home lives instead of being drained by them. Margaret Chin, who'd made senior partner the year before me, would leave promptly at 6 every Tuesday for her daughter's piano recitals, but she was also the most focused person in every meeting, never wasted time on office politics, had this clarity about priorities that I envied. James Morrison talked about his husband constantly, how they'd remodeled their kitchen together, their weekend hiking trips, their adopted rescue dogs, and somehow his personal happiness translated into professional confidence that made him impossible to rattle during cross-examinations. I'd always assumed that marriage and family were distractions, competitors for the focus and energy that success required, but watching my colleagues who'd figured out how to balance both made me wonder if I'd gotten the equation backwards. Maybe having someone who genuinely supported your dreams, who was there to celebrate your victories and comfort you after your defeats, actually made you stronger rather than weaker. Maybe the problem wasn't that I was too ambitious for love, but that I'd been choosing the wrong kind of love, relationships with people who saw my career as competition rather than collaboration. 6 months after Victoria moved out, I met Sarah during a joint literacy program between our schools, one of those collaborative initiatives where high schoolers mentor elementary kids with reading challenges. Sarah was the librarian at Oakwood Elementary, and from the moment she walked into our planning meeting, I could tell she was different from anyone I'd dated before. She had this natural warmth that put everyone at ease, the kind of person who remembered details about people's lives and asked follow-up questions because she genuinely cared about the answers. Where Victoria had been sharp edges and calculated ambition, Sarah was all gentle curves and authentic interest in building something meaningful with the kids we served. During our first meeting, while I was explaining how we could pair struggling readers with responsible upperclassmen, Sarah was taking notes and asking practical questions about logistics, but also about how we'd measure emotional growth alongside academic progress, how we'd help shy kids feel comfortable, how we'd celebrate small victories that might not show up on standardized tests. I've always believed that literacy isn't just about reading words, she said, tucking a strand of brown hair behind her ear in a gesture I'd come to find endearing. It's about helping kids discover that stories can be mirrors and windows, showing them themselves and opening up new worlds they never knew existed. The way she talked about education, with passion and purpose but without the ego that often came with academic discussions, made me remember why I'd become a teacher in the first place. Sarah had grown up in a house full of books, the daughter of 2 public school teachers who'd instilled in her a deep appreciation for stable family life and community service, and she'd always dreamed of creating that same nurturing environment for her own children someday. Our relationship developed naturally over 18 months, starting with coffee after planning meetings, then dinners to discuss program progress, then weekend hiking trips where we talk about everything except work. Sarah seamlessly integrated into my world in ways that felt effortless rather than forced, showing up to my football games not because she had to but because she enjoyed watching the kids I coached succeed, joining my family for Sunday dinners where she helped my mom in the kitchen and listened to my dad's stories about his mechanic shop with genuine interest rather than polite tolerance. She had this gift for making people feel seen and valued, whether it was remembering that Tommy Martinez was stressed about college applications or asking my mother about her garden every time she visited, actually listening to the answers and following up the next week. "Your girlfriend's a keeper," my mom told me after Sarah's third family dinner, watching through the kitchen window as Sarah played catch with my nephew in the backyard. "She's not trying to change anything about our family, just finding her place in it naturally." What struck me most about Sarah was how she approached our relationship as a genuine partnership, supporting my coaching responsibilities without making me feel guilty about the time commitment, encouraging my professional growth without competing or keeping score, treating my dreams as important as her own rather than obstacles to navigate around. When I got stressed about a particularly difficult student or a tough loss during football season, Sarah would listen without trying to fix everything, offering perspective when I asked for it but mostly just being present in ways that made me feel less alone with the challenges. "You know what I love about you?" she said one night after I'd spent an hour venting about budget cuts threatening our after-school tutoring program. "You actually care about these kids as people, not just test scores or graduation rates. That's rare and it's beautiful." The contrast with Victoria couldn't have been more obvious, not just in personality but in priorities, how Sarah treated our relationship as something worth investing in rather than something that might interfere with more important pursuits. When I decided to propose, I chose the lighthouse on Cape Cod where my parents had gotten engaged 35 years earlier, the same spot where my father had nervously fumbled through a speech about wanting to build a life with someone who made him a better man. Sarah and I had hiked there several times, and she'd always loved the view of the Atlantic, how the lighthouse had guided ships safely home for over a century, how it represented stability and hope in the middle of uncertainty. "Sarah," I said, getting down on one knee as the sun set behind us, "I want to build a life with you, the kind of life where we support each other's dreams and create something beautiful together, where we raise kids who know they're loved and contribute to a community that's better because we're part of it." She said yes immediately, tears streaming down her face, not because she was surprised by the question, but because she was overwhelmed by how right it felt, how natural this next step seemed after months of building something real together. We planned our wedding in 6 months, keeping it intimate and joyful, surrounded by our students, fellow teachers, and both our families in the same community center where I'd coached dozens of kids through basketball camps and academic struggles. My players served as groomsmen, Sarah's library volunteers helped with decorations, and our wedding felt like a celebration of everything we'd built together rather than a performance for people we barely knew. During our first dance, Sarah whispered in my ear, "I can't wait to see what we build together," and I realized that for the first time in my adult life, I was with someone who saw our relationship as the foundation for something bigger rather than a distraction from individual success. This was the partnership I'd always imagined but never quite found, someone who understood that love wasn't about keeping score or protecting yourself from compromise, but about creating something together that was stronger and more meaningful than anything either person could build alone. By 32, I'd achieved everything I'd mapped out during those late nights in law school when I'd studied until my eyes burned, fueled by instant coffee and sheer determination to prove that a girl from my background could make it in corporate law. I was now a senior partner, had my name on cases that made headlines, owned a penthouse that overlooked Boston Harbor, and commanded respect from colleagues who used to dismiss my opinions in meetings. But something had shifted in the last year, a restless anxiety that I kept trying to logic away but couldn't quite silence. I started noticing things that had been invisible to me before, like how my younger associates were getting married and having babies without their careers imploding, how they'd bring photos of their children to partner meetings and somehow still land the biggest clients, how they seemed energized by their personal lives rather than drained by them. Jennifer Walsh, who'd started at the firm 2 years after me, announced her second pregnancy during a case strategy meeting, and instead of the concerned looks I'd expected from the senior partners, they congratulated her and immediately started discussing how to redistribute her caseload temporarily. "The key is finding someone who supports your ambitions instead of competing with them," she told me over lunch when I asked how she managed everything. "My husband actually takes pride in my success, handles most of the household stuff so I can focus during trial prep, celebrates my victories like they're his own. It makes everything easier, not harder." I'd nodded and smiled, but her words sat uncomfortably in my chest, highlighting something I'd been trying not to think about for months: the growing silence in my perfect apartment, the way I'd started talking to my houseplants just to hear another voice, the fact that my most meaningful relationships were with my assistant and the baristas at the coffee shop downstairs. Online dating had become this exercise in futility that I kept approaching like another case to win, researching potential matches, crafting the perfect profile, strategizing about timing and presentation. The pool of available men my age fell into 2 predictable categories: those who were intimidated by my success and spent entire dinners asking me to explain what a corporate lawyer actually does, their eyes glazing over when I mentioned 7-figure settlements, and those who saw my career as a challenge to overcome. Investment bankers and consultants who turned every conversation into a competition about who worked longer hours or traveled more for business. "So you're one of those career women," said David, a hedge fund manager I'd met through a dating app, the phrase dripping with condescension as he cut his steak at an expensive restaurant he'd chosen specifically to impress me. "That's cool, but eventually you'll want to slow down, right? Focus on more important things." When I asked what could be more important than the work I'd spent a decade perfecting, he laughed and said something about biological clocks and women's priorities eventually realigning themselves, like my ambition was a phase I'd grow out of once I found the right man to complete me. I made it through dessert before excusing myself, realizing that dating had become another performance where I had to either minimize my achievements or defend them, never just enjoy them with someone who appreciated the person they'd helped me become. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning when my assistant, Ellen, was sorting through the mail and newspaper clippings that mentioned our recent cases. "Oh, congratulations to your friend," she said casually, holding up a section of the local paper's wedding announcements. Michael Thompson, the teacher? I remember when he used to call the office sometimes. My stomach dropped as I stared at the photo. Michael in a navy suit, looking genuinely happy in a way I'd forgotten he was capable of, next to a woman with kind eyes and a warm smile, both of them glowing with the kind of contentment that comes from building something real together rather than achieving something impressive alone. The caption mentioned that they'd met through their work in education, that she was a librarian, that they'd honeymooned hiking in Colorado because they loved outdoor adventures together. I locked myself in my office bathroom and cried for 20 minutes, not because I still loved Michael, but because seeing his happiness made me realize how empty my own success felt, how I'd spent years climbing a ladder that led to a beautiful view of nothing that mattered. The worst part was recognizing that Michael had offered me exactly what I now desperately wanted, a partnership that could have supported my ambitions while providing the emotional foundation I'd convinced myself was a luxury I couldn't afford. He would have celebrated my promotions, brought me soup when I worked late, listened to my trial stories with genuine interest instead of trying to top them with his own achievements. He would have made my success sweeter by sharing it, not diminished it by competing with it. A month later, I was assigned a case that felt like the universe's cruel joke, representing the wife in a family business dissolution where a couple was tearing apart the restaurant they'd built together over 15 years of marriage. Sitting in mediation sessions, watching them fight over assets they'd once been proud to create together, I realized I'd become an expert at helping other people protect their relationships while systematically destroying my own. We used to be partners in everything, the wife told me during a break, tears streaming down her face. The business, our dreams, raising our kids. Now we can't even be in the same room without lawyers. I thought about Michael's patient explanations of his coaching philosophy, how he'd light up talking about his students' progress, how he'd always made room for my career stress without taking it personally or trying to fix everything. I remembered Sarah's face in their wedding photo, the way she looked at him like he was exactly what she'd been hoping to find, and I understood with brutal clarity that I'd thrown away the kind of love that people spend their entire lives searching for because I'd been too afraid it would interfere with a success that felt increasingly hollow. That night, I sat in my expensive apartment with my impressive view and my meaningful accomplishments, and admitted to myself that I'd built exactly the life I thought I wanted while systematically destroying every chance I'd had at the life that might have actually made me happy. 3 months after seeing Michael's wedding photo, fate decided to twist the knife in the most unexpected way. I was assigned a pro bono case involving education funding cuts that were threatening after-school programs across the district, and the lead attorney suggested I consult directly with school administrators who could provide first-hand testimony about the impact on students. Michael's name appeared on the list of contacts as assistant principal at Roosevelt High School, and I stared at it for a full minute before convincing myself I could handle this professionally. I scheduled the meeting for a Tuesday morning, telling myself it was just another consultation, that enough time had passed for both of us to treat this as a routine business interaction. I arrived at the school district administrative building 15 minutes early, partly from habit and partly from nervousness I didn't want to admit to myself, and sat in my car gathering the composure that had gotten me through countless difficult depositions and hostile negotiations. The building was one of those utilitarian government structures from the 70s, all beige brick and narrow windows, the kind of place where dedicated people did important work without fanfare or recognition. I walked through the main entrance carrying my briefcase and legal pad, dressed in the same navy suit and heels that made me feel competent and in control during client meetings, but somehow felt like armor I wasn't sure would protect me from whatever emotions this encounter might trigger. The receptionist directed me to the 3rd floor, and as I walked down the hallway lined with student artwork and achievement certificates, I caught a glimpse through an open office door that made my breath catch in my throat. Michael was sitting behind a desk covered with student files and budget reports, looking older but somehow more settled than I remembered, his hair slightly graying at the temples in a way that made him look distinguished rather than worn down. He was reviewing what looked like college recommendation letters, occasionally making notes in the margins, and I could see that same focused attention he used to bring to grading papers in our shared apartment, the way he treated each student's future like it genuinely mattered to him personally. For a moment, I just watched him work, remembering how I used to find his dedication to his students both admirable and slightly frustrating, wishing he would bring that same intensity to advancing his own career in ways that might have impressed my colleagues. Now, seeing him in his element, I realized that his success had never been about climbing corporate ladders or accumulating impressive titles, but about making a real difference in individual lives, about building something meaningful in his community rather than just building his resume. "Honey, are you ready for lunch?" The voice came from behind me, and I turned to see a woman appearing in Michael's doorway, clearly pregnant and glowing with the kind of contentment that comes from being exactly where you want to be in life. She was pretty in an understated way, wearing a floral dress that accommodated her growing belly, her brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, radiating the kind of natural warmth that I'd spent years trying to project in networking situations. This had to be Sarah, the librarian who'd captured Michael's heart, and watching them together was like witnessing something I'd only read about in novels but never experienced myself. Michael's entire face transformed when he looked up at her, the same expression of pure joy that I'd seen in their wedding photo, but now I could see it in motion, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled at her, the way he immediately stood and moved toward her like being near her was the most natural thing in the world. "Just finishing up these recommendations," he said, and even his voice sounded different, lighter somehow, like he was constantly on the verge of sharing some private joke that only the two of them understood. "Tommy Martinez is applying to Boston College, and I want to make sure they understand what an incredible kid he is, not just academically but as a person who lifts up everyone around him." Sarah moved closer to his desk, resting her hand on her belly in that unconscious gesture that pregnant women make, and I watched as Michael's attention immediately shifted to her comfort, pulling out her chair, asking if she needed water, the kind of attentiveness that spoke to years of caring about someone's well-being without keeping score. "You always see the best in your students," she said, and there was something in her tone that suggested this was an ongoing conversation between them, not just casual small talk, that she genuinely appreciated this quality in him and had probably listened to hundreds of stories about kids he was trying to help succeed. "It's one of the things I fell in love with, how you make everyone feel like they matter." They moved around each other with the kind of easy familiarity that comes from sharing space and routines and dreams, Michael gathering his jacket while Sarah straightened papers on his desk, both of them focused on their lunch plans but clearly enjoying these small moments of connection in the middle of their busy day. I found myself studying their interaction like I was analyzing evidence in a case, looking for cracks or signs of tension, but seeing only the kind of genuine partnership I'd convinced myself was impossible to maintain alongside serious career ambitions. "Mrs. Chun called this morning," Sarah was saying as they prepared to leave. "She wants to thank you again for helping Marcus with his college applications. Apparently he got into 3 schools already, and she credits the extra time you spent working with him on his essays." Michael shrugged off the praise in that self-deprecating way I remembered, but I could see how much Sarah's recognition meant to him, how her appreciation for his work made him stand a little straighter, how having someone who understood and valued his contributions made him more confident rather than complacent. "He did the work," Michael said. "I just helped him see what he was capable of." As they moved toward the hallway where I was standing, I realized I needed to compose myself quickly, to shift into professional mode and treat this like any other business consultation rather than a confrontation with the life I'd chosen not to build. I straightened my shoulders, arranged my expression into the neutral competence I wore during client meetings, and prepared to introduce myself as the attorney handling the education funding case. "Michael," I said as they approached, and I watched both of them turn toward me with polite curiosity that shifted to recognition on Michael's part, though his expression remained carefully neutral. "Victoria," he said, and I appreciated that he kept his voice professional, that he wasn't going to make this awkward for any of us by bringing our personal history into his workplace. "This is my wife, Sarah. Sarah, this is Victoria Chin, the attorney who's here about the funding case." Sarah's smile was genuinely warm as she extended her hand, and I realized with uncomfortable clarity that Michael had probably told her about our relationship, about why it ended, but that she felt secure enough in what they'd built together not to see me as any kind of threat. "It's nice to meet you," she said. "Michael mentioned you'd be consulting with the district about the budget cuts. Thank you for taking this on pro bono. These programs make such a difference for our students." Her gratitude was sincere, and I found myself both impressed by her graciousness and stung by the reminder that the work I was doing, the case I'd taken to feel better about my contribution to society, was just another Tuesday for people like them who'd built their entire careers around serving their community. We made professional small talk for a few minutes, discussing the timeline for the case and the kind of testimony that would be most helpful, and I was struck by how easily Michael shifted between his roles as administrator and as husband, how he could discuss budget implications one moment and then ask Sarah if she was feeling okay the next, how natural it seemed for him to include her in his professional considerations. "We should let you get to your meeting," Sarah said finally, checking the time on her phone. "But thank you again for advocating for our kids." As they walked away together, Sarah's hand finding Michael's arm in an unconscious gesture of connection, I heard her say something that made him laugh. The kind of laugh that comes from sharing years of inside jokes and comfortable companionship, and I realized that I was watching the life I could have had, the partnership I'd been too afraid to embrace, thriving without me in ways that made my professional achievements feel hollow by comparison. Our professional meeting lasted exactly 47 minutes, and I conducted myself with the same competence I brought to every client consultation, taking detailed notes about budget shortfalls and program impacts, asking precise questions about student demographics and academic outcomes, building the case we'd need to present to the court. Michael was equally professional, providing comprehensive data about how the funding cuts would affect after-school tutoring, sports programs, and college preparation resources, explaining with quiet passion how these services weren't luxuries but lifelines for kids who didn't have other support systems. During our discussion, I learned details about his life that hit me like small revelations. He'd been promoted to assistant principal 2 years ago, was working on his doctoral degree in educational leadership, had started a mentorship program that paired high school students with local business professionals. "Sarah's been incredible through all of this," he mentioned when I asked about work-life balance during his graduate studies. "She handles so much of the household stuff when I'm in classes or writing papers, never makes me feel guilty about the time commitment, actually helps me practice presentations when I'm stressed about defending my research." The casual way he mentioned her support, like having a partner who genuinely wanted to see him succeed was the most natural thing in the world, reminded me of how I used to get frustrated when he'd spend weekends grading papers or preparing for parent conferences, how I'd seen his dedication to his students as competition for his attention rather than something admirable worth supporting. "How's she handling the pregnancy with everything else going on?" I found myself asking, though the question felt like pressing on a bruise. Michael's entire demeanor softened when he talked about Sarah, the same transformation I'd witnessed in the hallway, but now I could hear it in his voice too, this deep contentment that came from sharing his life with someone who made everything better rather than more complicated. "She's amazing," he said, and the simple sincerity in his voice was more devastating than any elaborate declaration of love could have been. "This is our second, actually. Our daughter Emma just turned 2, and Sarah's somehow managing the library, helping me with my dissertation, and growing another human being while making it all look effortless. I honestly don't know how I got so lucky." The phrase hit me like a physical blow. Our second child. Not only had Michael built the family life I'd convinced myself was impossible to balance with career success, but he'd built it twice over, created a home where love multiplied instead of divided, where professional ambitions and personal happiness actually supported each other. I thought about my own apartment, beautiful and silent and sterile, where the only sounds were my heels clicking across hardwood floors and the hum of expensive appliances keeping expensive food fresh for one person. "Emma's already excited about being a big sister," Michael continued, pulling out his phone to show me a photo that I didn't want to see but couldn't refuse to look at. A toddler with Sarah's warm eyes and Michael's gentle smile, sitting in a sandbox at what looked like their backyard, wearing a t-shirt that said, "Best Big Sister," and grinning at the camera with the kind of uninhibited joy that only comes from feeling completely secure in being loved. Sarah involves her in everything, talks to her about the baby, lets her help pick out clothes. She's going to be such a good mom to 2 kids because she's already such a natural at making everyone feel important. As he talked about his family, I realized that this was what genuine partnership looked like. Not 2 people competing for limited resources of time and attention, but 2 people creating something bigger together, where supporting each other's dreams actually multiplied everyone's happiness rather than requiring sacrifice from anyone. Sarah wasn't holding Michael back from achieving his professional goals. She was making it possible for him to pursue them while also building the family life that gave his work deeper meaning. Michael wasn't resenting her career or the time she spent at the library. He was proud of her contributions and grateful for the way she made their home a place where everyone could flourish. I completed the consultation professionally, gathered the information I needed for our case, thanked Michael for his time and insights, and walked back to my car with my composure intact until I sat down behind the steering wheel and finally allowed myself to process what I just experienced. The drive back to my penthouse felt like traveling through a parallel universe where I could see the ghost of the life I'd rejected, the family dinners and bedtime stories and shared dreams that I'd convinced myself were incompatible with the success I'd worked so hard to achieve. I thought about the ring Michael had offered me 4 years ago, how he'd wanted to build something permanent with someone who would celebrate his achievements instead of competing with them, how he'd been willing to support my career ambitions if I'd been willing to include him in my vision of the future. The most painful realization was understanding that Michael had offered me exactly what I now desperately wanted. A partnership that could have enhanced my professional success rather than threatening it, someone who would have been proud of my accomplishments and helped me build something meaningful beyond just accumulating impressive titles and salary figures. Sarah wasn't less ambitious than me. She was smart enough to recognize that love was a force multiplier, not a zero-sum game. That having someone genuinely invested in your happiness made everything else in life work better rather than worse. I pulled into the parking garage of my building, took the elevator to the 32nd floor, unlocked the door to my beautiful, empty apartment, and stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Boston Harbor, the same view I'd chosen specifically because it represented the pinnacle of individual achievement. But standing there in my designer heels and perfect suit, surrounded by all the symbols of the success I'd prioritized above everything else, I finally accepted the truth I'd been avoiding for years. Some opportunities for happiness don't wait for perfect timing, and some people don't get second chances to choose love over fear. I'd achieved everything I thought I wanted professionally, but I'd sacrificed the person who would have celebrated those achievements alongside me, who would have helped me build something that mattered beyond just proving I could succeed on my own. Michael had found someone who understood that true partnership means making each other stronger, and I was left with the hollow victory of getting everything I'd thought I needed while losing the person who could have made it all worthwhile.